be talking today about the need to be proactive in your practice. Immediately the mind will say, well, what about those teachings on having to let go of everything? Everything is inconstant, stressful, not self. Let's just let it go and be done with it. So before we get into the need for proactive practice, we have to explain a little bit about right view, because that right view gives some guidance in how to use those perceptions. These three perceptions are usually described as three characteristics, particularly when you get in the commentaries. In the canon, they're never described that way at all. The three perceptions that you apply to your experience with the purpose of learning to let go. And the question is, what do you let go at what stage of the practice? How do you apply those perceptions properly to what you're doing? And so it's important to understand that when the Buddha teaches about right view, he's actually talking about three different levels of right view. And the duties with regard to the different levels of right view will differ depending on what level of the practice you're on. And it doesn't mean you go from one level of right view and then you just drop that entirely when you go to the next one. There are times we'll be going back and forth, depending on the issue that you're dealing with at any one particular time. So before we look at the readings, I'd like to give a kind of a general discussion first. The afternoon will divide itself into two halves. The first half will be about right view, and then the second half will be more about specifically gaining proactive insight into the processes of fabrication. So the three levels of right view. The first level, mundane right view, is right view about karma. Now, there are actions. Actions do have results. You are actually responsible for your actions. And the results are going to be determined by the quality of the intention that goes into the action. Most of us, when we first learn about karma, there's that kind of an oh shit moment. When you think about all the things that you did in the past that you thought you got away with. And it's interesting to note when the Buddha teaches karma, he doesn't emphasize that side of the teaching. He emphasizes more the positive side. He actually starts his discussion of mundane right view with a very simple statement. There is what is given, there is what is sacrificed. Which, on the surface, would sound very strange. Of course, there are things that are given from one person to another. What he's talking about here is that giving actually has value. You have to look at this in the context of the culture of the time. For millennia, the Brahmins have been teaching that giving is very important, especially when you give to Brahmins. They actually have services for the dead, in which at one point where the Brahmins are doing the service, and then they will say, now we are taking on the voice of your dead ancestor. Give to the Brahmins. And then after you give it to the Brahmins, then the voice of your dead ancestor is supposed to say, give more. Now you can imagine after a couple millennia of this, people got tired. And so there were two reactions to this, both of which said, giving in any case has no meaning. One explanation was that everything you experience is determined by the past, either by some creator God or simply by the workings of the universe. And so that you don't really have any choice. When you give something, it's not because you have any particular virtue, you give because circumstances force it. And so therefore there is no virtue in giving. And the other explanation is that there's really nothing more to beings than just their bodies. And so when somebody dies, that's it. So why bother giving to anything to somebody who's just going to disappear anyhow? Doesn't really accomplish anything. And so when the Buddha was saying that there is what is given, he was basically saying two things. One is you do have the choice, which is why it's a virtuous choice. And you have something that you have total right over. You could choose to give it or not give it. And you choose to give it out of generosity, out of a sense of wanting to help. And there's virtue in that. And secondly, he's saying that people don't end with their death, that there is something that goes on, that continues, a connection from one life to the next. And so helping one another is a really worthwhile thing, because it doesn't just disappear into nothingness. It actually goes to somebody that has continuing value. Further on, and then the Buddha talks about in mundane right view that there are good and bad actions, which have good and bad results. Then he also says there are spontaneously reborn beings. There is this world and the next. That's his way of saying that there is rebirth. There is something that happens, that you go, another world that you go to after you die. When he's talking about spontaneously reborn beings, it's not that they come out of nothing. It's just that in certain levels of being, you don't have to go through a normal birth or a childhood up to adult period. When you get to heaven, bang, you're a deva already. You go to hell, you're a hell being immediately. You don't have to have hell parents. That's for the human realm, you know. But in the heavens, you don't have divine parents, which can also be for the human realm if you're lucky. Then he goes on to say there is mother and father, which again, it sounds pretty obvious. Of course we have mothers and of course we have fathers. But here again he's saying that you have a special debt of gratitude to your parents because they did have the choice. Your mother could have aborted you, or when you were born, there's actually a story in the canon where this one woman gives birth to a child and puts it out in a trash heap. That could have happened to you, but your parents decided not to do that. With all the kicking and screaming and crying and everything you did, they put up with it. And so you have to honor that. They stuck with you when things were bad. And even if your physical parents did not stick with you, the fact that they gave you a body and your mother had to go through all of that pain of pregnancy, you owe her a debt of gratitude. In fact, in Thailand, when they have an ordination for young men, more traditionally now than they do now, they would have this long chant. It's actually longer than the ordination ceremony, where someone comes and chants about the difficulties that your parents had in raising you, because you're supposed to be dedicating the merit of your ordination to the parents. And 9/10 of the chant is about those 9 months that you were in your mother's womb. And it gets pretty graphic about your mother's morning sickness and all the times you started kicking her from inside, that kind of thing. So that you're feeling really grateful by the time that the chant is over. So when the Buddha talks about karma, he's emphasizing your freedom of choice. That your actions really do make a difference, and you have the choice to act skillfully or not skillfully. And there is a genuine virtue in acting skillfully. He does, however, say that karma is complex. You have to remember the basic causal principle that the Buddha was working on is something called this-that conditionality. And it comes down to two causal principles working in conjunction. One is that some things arise together and pass away together, some causes and effects. In other words, that's instantaneous. Then there are other causes that will have an effect over time. An example, the first one is you put your finger into the fire, you don't have to wait until the next lifetime for it to hurt. Hurts right away. An example, the second kind is that you plant a seed and you're not going to get to eat the rice right away or get to eat the fruit right away. It's going to take time for that seed to mature. And so karma is of both kinds, which means that at any one time you've got causes in the present moment affecting what you're experiencing and also causes coming in from the past. And as I explained last time, what you've got is potentials coming in from the past that your present fabrication, your present choices will shape either skillfully or unskillfully into the experience you have. And this works out on the cosmic level in the sense that, say you do something bad in this lifetime, it doesn't mean that you will automatically have to go to a bad place next time. Sometimes you get a kind of a free pass for a lifetime or two. Although the Buddha said, as long as that the seed is there, it will sprout. But then again, it's sprouting. How you experience it will depend on your state of mind at the moment that it finally bears fruit. There's a sutta where he compares this process to taking a big lump of salt, and if you put it in a small cup of water, you cannot drink the water because it's just too salty. He says that's like a mind that is very narrow and confined, that hasn't been trained, and the results of past karma come in, and they can be, if it's bad karma, they can be very strongly experienced. However, if you took that same lump of salt and you put it into a large, clean river of water, you could still drink the water in the river simply because there's so much water in the salt. The large river there stands for the mind that has been trained, and he basically describes the training in 4 terms. One is that your mind is practicing the unlimited, i.e. is practicing the unlimited goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. Secondly, it's able to withstand being overcome by pain, and we're able to be overcome by pleasure. Thirdly, you're trained in virtue, and then fourthly, you're trained in discernment. So these trainings will actually mitigate the effects of past karma. So it's not like once you've done something, you will, i.e., deserve to get 100% payback. How you actually experience it will depend on your training of your mind. It's interesting, when the Buddha is talking about karma, he never talks about people deserving to suffer. You'll notice when he talks about it here, he is teaching a path to the end of suffering. There's never the point he said, I will teach people not to suffer only if they don't deserve to suffer. It's for everybody, whether you quote-unquote deserve to suffer or not. That whole question of people deserving to suffer gets thrown out. This is one of the aspects of karma that most people don't like. They think if somebody's suffering, that someplace back in there they had some bad karma, that means that they have to suffer or they deserve to suffer. The Buddha never put it in those terms. They have an action from the past, but whether they will suffer from it or not in the present depends on their state of mind. Which means you can help other people. One, train their mind so they don't suffer. And secondly, you have to realize it's not the case that as you may have heard, there's a statement that says, if you want to see someone's past actions, you look at their present condition. If you want to see their future condition, you look at their present actions. That's way too simplistic. It's assuming that you have one karma account and what you see in the present moment is the running balance. Actually, the Buddha's image is as a field of seeds. With every intentional action, you're planting a seed, planting a seed, planting a seed. So you can imagine how many seeds you have in your field. And some of them will ripen quickly, some of them will ripen slowly. So there are lots of different potentials in your field, which means you look at somebody, you cannot see what their past karma potentials are. You see a few that are ripening right now, but maybe there are others that are ready to ripen. And with your help, maybe they can water the seeds that were good for good karma. So it doesn't mean that somebody is suffering, they're stuck in the suffering and that you can't help them, or you shouldn't try to help them. You actually should, to whatever extent you can. So that's basically mundane right view. Are there any questions on that before we go on? Yes?
Ajahn, you mentioned the example of sticking your finger in a fire as an example of things arising at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, not to be too much into my nature, but there is actually a delay between sticking your finger in a fire and feeling pain there.
Okay, your finger is much slower than your mind. Your finger is much slower than your mind. I mean, the thing, okay, I could say spitting in the wind. You say, yeah, it takes a few seconds for the spit to come back, but it's pretty quick.
I wonder if there truly are things that arise at exactly,
They come together.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He's specifically here talking about things happening in the mind.
Yeah.
And you have a particular emotion or a particular thought, and there will be a particular response. And if you learn to drop that thought, it goes away. In fact, the process of fabrication we're talking about, directed thought, evaluation, perceptions, feelings, these things arise and pass away pretty quickly, and so they will have an immediate effect. Yes?
You mentioned the 4 ways in which you train the mind to mitigate the effects of karma.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain further this?
Virtue and discernment?
You mentioned before, but I didn't quite hear.
Okay, the first one was developing unlimited states of mind, Brahma Viharas. The second one is learning to train the mind not to be overcome by pain or overcome by pleasure. That's probably the important one out of the bunch. And you do that. Concentration practice actually is very important for that. You're sitting down and there are going to be pains in your body. You say, I do not let myself get overcome by the pain. I will not be dissuaded and not moved away by the pain. But it also helps you to withstand pleasure, in the sense that you don't just, when the mind finally does settle down, it feels really good, you don't just go wallowing in the pleasure. You realize, okay, there's pleasure here, it will do its work on the body, it will do its work in my mind, I don't have to go and gobble it down right away. So the pleasure can be there, but you don't lose your focus, you don't lose your mindfulness, you don't lose your alertness. So it comes down to virtue, concentration, discernment are the things you need to train yourself in. As far as the discernment, well, first with the Brahma Viharas, there's a passage where the Buddha was wounded by a stone sliver. Devadatta threw the rock down the mountain, to kill the Buddha, and the rock was shattered, and one of the slivers of the shattered rock got into the Buddha's foot, pierced the foot, and he had to take it out. And he was lying down recovering. And Mara comes along and says, "You poor thing, here you are moping about your pain." And the Buddha says, "I'm not moping at all, I'm spreading goodwill to everybody." And that's why he's using that unlimited state of mind so that his mind is not overcome by the pain. Anything else? Yes?
Is it because you could die at that moment if you're clinging to that pain? I mean, let's say, I mean, I know that the idea is not to die clinging,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and
Well, that's part of it. And also, even if you don't die, you're sitting there, "Oh, poor me, why is this," that you're identifying with it, and you're feeling victimized by, the world. Why is it I'm injured and nobody else is injured? And you have to remember, you're not the only person who's being injured. Yes?
I'm remembering what you just said about a story I heard regarding Ajahn Geoff.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a palm reader read his hand, and the palm reader was so surprised that he had so much anger. And he said, "But I don't pick it up."
Mm-hmm.
And it's confused me a bit since I heard it.
Mm-hmm.
So the same thing with pain, he didn't pick up the pain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But anger is so different to me.
Yeah, it's a mental quality, and pain is a more physical.
And I started to wonder about how you can find insight in your anger but not pick it up.
Okay, the insight there is you see that something is wrong. And the first thing you've got to question is, okay, is it really wrong? Are things really not the way they should be? And then the next question is there anything I can do to change? Now those are the rational questions you would ask during, when you see something is wrong. And I think what he's talking there about is realizing that the ability to see that something is wrong can be very heightened. A lot of the Ajahns in Thailand were very quick on seeing when something was wrong, but they didn't allow that to get turned into anger. The angry response, the emotional response. And you'd see, they tell another story about Ajahn Geoff. Was someone went to see him, and he got there as Ajahn Geoff was chewing out one of the monks who had done something really bad. And so he would chew out the monk for a bit, and then he'd say very, very nice things, friendly things to the other person, then come back, chew out the monk again, and kind of back and forth, just to show, okay, he wasn't carrying it around. He knew how to be forceful with that person. It's like when you're a parent, sometimes even you're not really angry at your child, but you realize the child has done something really stupid, and if they repeat it again, they're going to get themselves in danger. So you've got to make it really, you've got to show that you're worked up, even though you may not be worked up about the issue. So it's his ability to recognize when something is wrong. That's what I think what he's talking about, because the word tosai in Thailand means, tosai doesn't mean only anger, but also means the ability to see faults. And so actually what you want out of a teacher, if you're serious, you want a teacher who can actually point out to you, you're doing something wrong, and I want to stop, just stop it now. So that's how I would understand that answer. Okay, with mundane right view, one other point I wanted to make is that when the Buddha is talking about the various truths that he teaches, truths don't just sit there. He's not just giving you useful or interesting information about the world out there. He's pointing out certain qualities that you have to look for in your mind and in the world. And then there's a duty that goes with that. The truths are there to serve a purpose. It's interesting that the word for meaning in Pali, atta, A-T-T-H-A. Now we're not talking A-T-T-A, which is self. This is A-T-T-H-A, atta. It means the meaning of a word, but it also means the purpose, and it also means the benefit, and also means the goal. All four things are working together there. So when we're taught a truth, the question is, okay, what's the purpose of this truth? Not only what do the words mean, what is the purpose of taking this on? What's the benefit of it? What's the duty that's implied in order to get the full benefit out of it? Now, in terms of the duties or the various levels of right view, there's one passage there. You go through the canon, you look for the teachings that the Buddha said were categorically true across the board. There are only 2 teachings, and interestingly, the 3 characteristics of the 3 perceptions are not one of them. The those that are true across the board are 1, unskillful action should be abandoned and unskillful action should be developed. And then when you get to the 4 Noble Truths, under first level of Noble Right View, okay, suffering should be comprehended, its cause should be abandoned, its cessation should be realized, and the path should be developed. So for the Buddha, the truth is not something that just kind of sits there on the page or sits there in the words. These categories carry duties. And we'll see why this is particularly important as we go on. As I said, the second level of right view is the 4 Noble Truths. And it's interesting to see how the Buddha gets from the first to the second. There is a talk that he gave, and it's reported several times in the canon. The interesting thing is it's never depicted. In other words, we don't get to know what the words are. We just get to know the list of topics. And the Buddha starts out the list of topics with generosity, with giving, how good it is to give. When he talks about, that there's kind of a Buddhist culture that's developed around that. Notice everything begins with giving, both his description of mundane right view and then as you're moving from mundane right view to noble right view. And because he wants to emphasize the fact that there is freedom of choice, monks have to be very particular about how they discuss generosity. Because here we are on the receiving end of everybody else's generosity. We have to learn how not to abuse it. Number one thing is we don't give dana talks. They say dana is a 2,500-year-old tradition. The dana talk is a 30-year-old tradition. When the Buddha talked about generosity, he would talk about it after someone had given, to basically make them feel good about the fact that they'd given. But he wouldn't say, talk to so as to make them want to reach into their wallet and give out a little extra money. Aside from the fact they didn't have wallets then. Secondly, when monks are asked, or people come to monks and ask them, where should I give this gift? The monks are supposed to say, where you feel inspired, where you feel it would be well used, where it would be well taken care of. That's it. No fundraising. And the whole purpose of this is to preserve that sense of freedom around the act of giving. As you look back on times when you gave a gift because you had to, and other times when you gave a gift because you wanted to, the feeling is very different. You might try that as an exercise to think about when was the first time that you actually gave something, not because your mom and dad said you had to give it because it was Christmas or somebody's birthday or whatever, but you just saw something you wanted to give it. In my own case, the one thing that sticks up in my mind was when I was 10. We moved to Kansas, and prior to that we lived on a farm. And we got to Kansas and we lived in a town. And I could get on my bike and I could ride my bike down to a store. Now, I'd never been able to do that before. And so you can imagine what I did. I would go down to the store. And one day I was in the store and I saw an egg separator. The little plastic thing where you can put the egg in and it captures the yolk and the whites go through. And I'd seen my mother baking, separating the whites from the yolks, I don't know how many times. I thought, she'd probably like this. And it wasn't too expensive, so I bought it and gave it to her. And then years later, after she died, we were going through her things, and guess what we found? The leg separator. Even though she had made the mistake one time of putting it in the dishwasher and was kind of melted. But she kept it. So you might want to, as an exercise, think about that. The gifts you give freely are the ones that mean the most to both sides. And so this is what the Buddha is trying to encourage, that attitude, which is why we have this etiquette around giving. So when the Buddha starts out the graduated discourse, he's talking about feeling good about giving, realizing the implications of that you had the freedom of choice to give, or freedom of choice not to give, but you decided to give. Same, the second quality is virtue. What he's doing here is getting you ready to get into the Four Noble Truths by talking about karma. Virtue, and the what a good thing it is to be virtuous. The third thing he would talk about would be heaven. When you're virtuous and you're generous in this lifetime, you die, you will tend to go to a good rebirth. And again, it's interesting. There are not that many detailed descriptions of heaven in the canon at all. In fact, there are almost none. Hell? Yeah, there's a lot. But there's not much about heaven. Then the third thing is, though, okay, even heaven has its drawbacks. For number one thing, it's not eternal. And when you fall, tend to fall hard. As the Buddha said, the number of beings after they leave heaven are reborn again as devas, and they're reborn again as human beings, is extremely, extremely small. Most devas go down to the lower realms. So there's danger. And so the Buddha is talking about the drawbacks of looking just for the rewards of heaven. He talks about then the degradation and the defilement of sensuality. In other words, our desire simply for sensual rewards is defiling to the mind, and it pulls us down. And then finally, after he's made that point, and he talks an awful lot about the drawbacks of sensuality. Then he goes into the rewards of renunciation. In other words, that the happiness that could come from renunciation, you finally get the mind inclined to think, that would be a good thing, if I could find some well-being that is not pulled down by sensuality. And then you'd be ready for the Four Noble Truths. Now notice that he's taking the teaching of karma and using the teaching of karma to get the mind prepared for the Four Noble Truths. Because again, the Four Noble Truths is an extension of that. You've got the cause of suffering, which is a kind of action, unskillful, and the suffering is the result. And then you've got the path, which is skillful action, and then the result of that would be the cessation of suffering. So it's an application of the teaching on karma, but you're bringing it inside. This is very different from the way most of us were introduced to the Four Noble Truths. If you take a college course on Buddhism, that's one of the first things they talk about, the Four Noble Truths. And there are a few cases where the Buddha would launch into the Four Noble Truths talking to some of his students, but often not. He'd start you off with generosity and virtue first and work your way up to the Four Noble Truths. So, the Four Noble Truths. This is the first level of transcendent right view. It takes all that issue of your actions and their importance, and it focuses on the problem of suffering. Why is it that the mind suffers? And when he's talking in terms of suffering here, you have to realize there are basically two categories of suffering. There's the suffering that comes simply because things arise and pass away. There's a stress involved in the process of their arising and passing away, which is natural to things, natural to experiences all over. And then there's the suffering that comes from craving and clinging, and that doesn't have to be there. And that's what he's focusing on. It's the suffering that we cause ourselves. That's what he's focusing on in the Four Noble Truths, and that's something to be abandoned. And you discover that once you take care of that suffering, then the stress of experience arising and passing away does not impinge on the mind. So you solve this problem. Some people say, well, the Buddha came to wipe out all forms of suffering. He said, no, he's focusing specifically on this one, the suffering that you cause yourself. Which is why the path is something that, the Buddha couldn't come and save us. And he didn't go out trying to change the world, except by getting everybody to change the world from within. This is what the Four Noble Truths are about. Now the Four Noble Truths, as I said, are not just four interesting facts about suffering. There's a question of priorities. He's saying this is the big issue in life, is the suffering that we cause ourselves. And they are categories for dividing your experience. Learn how to look at your experience, not in the sense of me or mine or what's outside of me and mine, but simply where is there stress, what's causing it, what can I do to put it to an end. So in terms of the First Noble Truth, he gives examples of stress and suffering. He doesn't provide a definition. You may have seen people say, well, the word dukkha comes from whatever, something that's poorly, like a wheel that's poorly put on or something like that. That's not in the canon. The Buddha's not trying to define things by defining the term. He simply gives you a list of the different causes of suffering from which you can probably relate to. There's the stress of aging, illness, death, the stress of birth, the stress of not getting what you want, the stress of being with what you don't like, the stress of being separated from what you do like, sorrow, lamentation, despair. And then he says 5 clinging aggregates. That's the part that's difficult to relate to, but the 5 clinging aggregates are actually what he says is the way you can get a handle on stress, because that's where you want to look. So you have to learn how to look at what are these 5 aggregates. We talked about them a little bit last night. They are activities of the mind, form, which is your sense of physical things, your experience of physical things, primarily your body, but also other physical things outside. Feeling, these are feeling tones of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Perceptions are the labels that you put on things, either individual words or visual images. You identify things. Fabrication is the activity of the mind in shaping its experience. And then finally there's consciousness, which is your awareness of these things. Clinging to any of these things is suffering. Now the clinging here, the word for clinging also means to feed. You're feeding off of your sense of the form. You're feeding off your feelings. You're feeding off the perceptions. Specifically what you're feeding off is the sense of pleasure that you can get from them. And the Buddha talks about how these things are not just kind of there in the world, but we actually are involved in the process of shaping them to our intentions. There's potentials coming in from the past, and this is where the teaching on karma comes in again. There are potentials coming in from the past that then you then shape into actual feelings and actual perceptions, fabrications, for the purpose of getting something out of them, trying to get pleasure from them. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the second half of the day, second half of the afternoon. Okay. The cause of stress, or the origination of stress, is one of 3 forms of clinging. There's either clinging for sensuality, clinging for becoming, or clinging for non-becoming. Sensuality here is not sensual pleasure, it's your fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures. You can be sitting here thinking about, I want to have pizza tonight. You can spend the whole afternoon thinking about pizza. You've got Hawthorne Street just down here, you know. And you can decide which of the pizzerias you want to go to, what kind of pizza you'd like, and the mind can just fascinate itself with all this planning about the pleasures you're going to get out of the pizza. When you actually get the pizza, it doesn't take that long to eat it. And the actual experience of it may not be quite what you thought it was. But then you can sit about and think about it for another couple of hours afterwards. Boy, wasn't that a great pizza? Really great pizza. I want to go back to that pizzeria again. And so when the Buddha's talking about clinging for sensuality, or craving for sensuality, we're craving for that ability to to fantasize about sensual pleasures. That's what we're stuck on. That's what we go for. Imagine for a minute, okay, you go down to, you've decided which pizza place you want to go to, and you go down there, the doors are closed. So it doesn't matter, there are other pizza places. You can manage. But if someone were to tell you, you are forbidden for thinking about pizzas this afternoon, your mind would rebel. And you sit there, I'm going to show up, I'm going to think about pizza all afternoon. So it's a sign that we really are attached to these things. Years ago there was a book that was printed, it was called Open to Desire. It was supposed to be a Buddhist analysis of desire, in which the author was saying that the Buddha said desire is okay as long as you're not attached to the object. It's got it totally backwards. I mean, that's a formula for serial sex offenders. You can desire, but you're not attached. The Buddha said it's our fascination with those kinds of desires. That's what we're stuck on. Craving for becoming. Becoming here is a world of experience, and you're taking on an identity within that world of experience. And both the world and the identity center on a desire. Usually for sensuality, but it can be a desire for something else. What this is basically, you have a specific desire, and then the question is, how are you going to get it? And as soon as you ask that question, how are you going to get it, you've got 2 senses of self involved in there right there. One is the you that's going to be enjoying that pleasure, and the other is the you that's going to go out and get it. The self as the consumer and the self as the producer. We have both sides. And that's for each desire that we take on. For example, you're sitting here thinking about the pizza place. The parts of the world that have to do with your desire for pizza are the parts of that particular world that's going to be in that particular becoming. And your own ability to get the pizza, you have the money in your pocket or you have the credit card in your pocket. Speaking of which, yesterday I saw an interesting exchange. We got to the airport, we had to pay a baggage fee, and the Naga asked the guy behind the counter, "Can we use paper money?" Couldn't you actually use cash nowadays? So your ability to pay for the pizza, your ability to get over to the pizza place, those are the relevant parts of you in that world. As far as the world is concerned, the parts that are either going to be conducive to get the pizza or the parts that are going to get in the way of getting the pizza, those are the relevant parts of the world. Other things don't matter at that point. And we have many of these worlds going through the mind in the course of the day. Now sometimes they work together, and sometimes they work at cross purposes. I suppose there's the you who wants to be a fine, upstanding member of the community, but there's also the you who wants to have an affair with your neighbor. Okay. Two very conflicting worlds, two very conflicting identities. And the Buddha says this kind of craving leads to suffering. In an interesting way, the third kind of craving that leads to suffering is craving for non-becoming, which you try to obliterate that particular sense of self, or you try to obliterate that particular world that you don't like. Now the reason this too is a form of suffering is that, as the Buddha said, as soon as you start taking on that desire, you've created a new becoming, the becoming of the destroyer. I want this to be destroyed, now I am the destroyer, I have the particular powers to destroy this. And that's a different kind of becoming. So that too leads to suffering, which, as you can see, causes a problem. How are you going to get out of becoming without craving non-becoming? And the Buddha's answer is that you develop the path. You take it on. You basically take on the issue of becoming kind of sideways. We'll talk about that in a minute. The cessation of suffering, the Buddha said, is learning how to develop dispassion for those kinds of craving. That doesn't mean that you obliterate them. You just kind of let them go. You see them arise, and you see how they. You don't have to get involved in creating them any further, and then they just kind of end of their own. And the path is what enables you to do that. The path is the strategy for getting around these forms, the problem of becoming and non-becoming. And you do that by developing the path factors from right view all the way through right concentration. Any questions on that? Yes.
With the samadhi hanya, isn't it true that you need to establish a sukha within in order to see this,
Mm-hmm.
to see precisely what we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
what's operating?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to say that's not particularly easy, but it's a process.
It's a process. Mm-hmm. And you notice what you said just now, virtue, concentration, discernment, that's not the order of the path factors. The path factors start with right view, right resolve, which are the wisdom factors, the discernment factors, then go through virtue and then through concentration. And the question is, well, why does the Buddha teach both lists? And it's because the discernment was actually going to do the work. And the discernment has to give guidance to the rest of the factors. But it's not enough without having developed those other factors. The other factors actually teach lessons to right view.
The right view needs to be in place in order for the...
To some extent, at least. I mean, it's like when you're building a building, you put up a post, but you also have to brace it a little bit because the post is going to wobble a little bit. But then when you start building the rest of the whole building, find the whole thing gets solid because all the different parts are helping one another stay solid. So you've got right view, but it's still just kind of theoretical. It can still waver. But then when you start doing the other factors, because the other factors are going to teach you about what is it like to develop a skillful quality, what is it like to abandon an unskillful quality, and you begin to realize, okay, I have to have desire. When you first read the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha doesn't talk about just the basic list. Desire is not mentioned any place except for craving and the cause of suffering. But then when you look into more detail in the path, you get into right effort, And part of right effort is generating the desire to abandon the unskillful and develop skillful qualities. So then here's a role for desire on the path, which you wouldn't have known until you actually had put the teachings into practice.
And in a sense, you're weaving the intellectual part with the bodily.
With the bodily part, and also just as you get more hands-on experience, it's like going to school and let's say going to a military academy and learning military strategy in the classroom, and then you get out there in the field and you say, "Oh, this is very different." The enemy is not lined up on the board where I can see it clearly. So you have to think in different ways, and you realize, okay, there are other skills involved aside from just the theoretical side. Yes?
I thought I heard you say that there's kind of a natural, unavoidable stress associated with arising and cessation beyond the clinging and craving. I haven't heard that before. Can you expand on that?
Well, it's simply the fact that things are put together by causes means that they're unstable, and their instability. There's stress in the instability itself. And especially if you're going to try to place your happiness on those things, that's when you realize how unstable these things are. Put it another way, arahants can still feel pain in their bodies, but they don't suffer from it in their minds. This is what allows for people, as Ajahn Geoff used to say, when arahants eat something sour, they squeeze up their eyes because it's sour, but the mind itself is not stressed by it. Good question.
Why do the devas fall so?
They've basically exhausted their account.
It can't be a continual...
Well, it depends on what kind of deva you are. If you're a wise deva, you could try to continue doing good things if you can. But there are a lot of them, as they used to say, like Californians. They're just there on the beach, and it's just really nice on the beach. And who cares about what's going to happen tomorrow? I'm just going to enjoy myself on the beach. There's a lot of devas who think that way.
So in the stories about the devas, they're cashing in, basically, as opposed to replenishing and really applying that wisdom that got them there in the first place.
Right. And that happens in a lot of ways. You see some people, who've worked really hard all their lives, and they finally cash in, and then they forget all the virtues that got them there. They think, well, now that I'm wealthy, I can afford to, forget about all that. There's a story in the canon about this one woman who was very diligent in providing food for 2 monks, all during their lifetimes. Then they all die, and she goes up to the Dusita heaven, which is one of the higher heavens, and it's where the more mature devas tend to go. And she said, well, gee, what about those monks that I was feeding all this time? Where are they? And she looks around and she finds them with the Gandharvas. Now the Gandharvas are the teenagers of the Deva world. They're into fast vehicles, they're into music, they're into sex, the whole schmear. In fact, I have a personal theory that most UFO sightings are Gandharvas, but that's... we'll save that for another day. And so she goes down and she gives them a piece of her mind. She says, I did not feed you so you could become Gandharvas. And one of the Gandharvas gets very embarrassed, and so he goes off and he practices and he goes to a higher level. But the other Gandharva just couldn't care less, and he just spends all of his time in Gandharva pleasures. So that's why the devas fall. And even if they're relatively lucky devas who come back to the human world, it's kind of a hard fall. Can you imagine having all your pleasures, all your desires immediately satisfied, and then you get to a world where they're not immediately satisfied? My teacher had a couple of students who were very difficult people, and one time he said, they were devas in their last lifetime. So it's not always a good thing, yes.
Is becoming one of the 12 limbs?
It is.
And the way you explained it is the same way that you explained to the...
It applies the same way. You can look at a book. There's a book called The Paradox of Becoming that explains the whole relationship there. Because it is both a macro process and a micro process. I mean, the fact that you are who you are as a human being in this world, that's a macro becoming. And it comes from, however, your micro becomings, these little identities that you take on in your mind as you're trying to pursue your desires as you go through the world. Any question? Yes?
I'm a little confused on, like, when you go to different realms because of merit, can you, like, achieve awakening in any realm instead of, like, having to fall back down and go?
They talk about devas who do gain awakening, yeah. There's sutras where the Buddha gives a Dharma talk and all these devas become stream enterers. If you become a non-returner in the human realm, you actually achieve full awakening in one of the Brahma worlds. But again, it has to be, some of the more serious devas. Below the human world, I've never heard of anybody gaining awakening.
I have some confusion on how the arahant is kind of relates to reality. So on the one hand, I kind of hear that defilements don't arise for an arahant, that thoughts of lust or hatred or conceit or whatever just are totally non-existent. But on the other hand, I kind of hear that those thoughts might arise as just condic processes, but that since there's no attachment to them, they just kind of go to cessation. Could you?
I'm not an arahant, I can't tell you. But the number one thing is that there's no attraction to those things for them at all. I mean, it's not like they cannot think of certain things. They could think about anything they wanted to think about, but certain things just hold no appeal.
So there's nothing in the canon that says whether or not those things just don't arise, or whether or not they do arise, but they just cease.
Well, there's one where they talk about an arahant's reaction to lust. And he says the thought of the sexual act, either they view either with total indifference or disgust. So it means the thought could come, but doesn't. Yes. Yadaya? Tip? Oh, okay. Yes.
In relation to what you said, in one of the talks you said, the devas look on our pleasures like we look on the pleasure of animals.
Mm-hmm.
And that hits home with me. It is true.
Mm-hmm.
But then later on, you still fall. Even though it's like the animals, you're still not free from it.
Yeah. Well, take sex for example. It's pretty disgusting, and yet people go for it. And then part of you thinks, well, how about if I had a life where I could just have sex with anybody I wanted to? And that's what an animal life is like. But you forget about, okay, if you had sex with anybody you wanted to, everybody else in that world would be having sex with anybody they wanted to, and you start fighting over what you could get. When the mind gets weakened toward the end of life, some of the defenses that you build up start going away. And things that you would normally be ashamed to think about, suddenly they come back to the mind. And that's how the mind falls.
Even within my life,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and I don't understand why I can't stay in that.
Well, the problem with sensuality is you get bored with the same things all over again. I mean, think about food. The weird things, those foams they make in Europe, where if you're going to a Michelin 5-star restaurant and they have these all bizarre ingredients. Some of them are pretty disgusting when you think about them. But they say, hey, let's have a new flavor sensation. And so you've gotten all the normal flavor sensations, and you say, well, something else. Where else? And you start going off in weird directions. Because sensuality is never satisfying.
So
Well, they're in if they have a noble attainment, they're really in a different place from most people. With jhanas, I mean, an ordinary, run-of-the-mill, unenlightened person can get into jhana, but the jhana can fail, can fall. This may take a little time, but there's a great story in Thailand. Two great stories. They're relevant here. One is there was these two friends who die, and one of them becomes a deva, and the other becomes a dog. And the friend who's a deva starts looking for the old friend. Where's my old friend? Where did that happen? My gosh, my friend has been reborn as a dog. Now this deva has a few powers, and so he turns the dog into a prince. So here's this prince kind of wandering around without a kingdom, but he's a prince, And he meets up with this princess, and the princess falls in love with him. And she takes him home. And the parents say, where did you get this person? She said, I don't know, but I love him. I want to marry him. Said, we don't even know where he's coming from. What kind of prince is this? Well, he's obviously a prince, and I want him. And so she prevails over her parents, and they get married. And the dog, quote, prince, the dog/prince is living there in the family. But then one day she comes into their apartment and finds him in the bathroom eating shit out of the toilet. And she realized, okay, this is not a real prince, So he gets expelled. So, it can happen. The second story, this is a little bit more complicated, but it gives you an idea of the perspective of rebirth. There was this deva who's got a deva wife, and she's really, really good looking. And he's constantly bragging about, I've got the prettiest deva wife in the heavens. And his friends, the other devas, get sick and tired of hearing him brag. And so they say, if she's really that beautiful, you see that hermit down there on earth who's sitting there meditating, and they look down at this guy, and he's been out in the sun for how many years, so he's tanned, so his skin is like leather, and termites have built a nest up over part of his body, and the lizards are running all over, and he's just sitting there totally in jhana. And they say, if your wife can make him break jhana, then we'll believe that she's really cool, So he gets his wife all dressed up in all of her deva founder, and she's feeling embarrassed about the whole thing. And so he gets her to stand in front of this hermit while he's meditating there, and then the deva is hiding in the trees behind to see what's going to happen. And the hermit begins to realize there's somebody there. He opens his eyes, he sees the woman, he also sees the husband in the trees. And he immediately realizes what's going on. He says, you are tempting me. I'm going to put a curse on you. You're going to die and be reborn as human beings. You're going to be separated for 3 times, in spite of the fact that you really love each other. And only after the 3rd time will the curse be done. And that's the beginning of a very long story, a very long poem about the male deva gets reborn as a poor merchant, and the female deva gets reborn as the daughter of a really rich merchant. And it talks about how he's walking down the street one day, and she's up in the balcony, and she looks down at him, he looks up at her, and bang, instant falling for each other. And so they have to elope. And he takes her on the sea, and they get shipwrecked. And he searches and searches and searches for her, and he comes to this island where this big empty palace, and there inside the palace is her body under a glass coffin. Of course, he loses it. Only then does he realize that this body that he's seeing is deva, deva figment. So he actually finds her eventually. And then they get separated a second time. And then the final time is they're in the woods, and she's lost, and so he's trying to find her. And he sees her being devoured by a tiger. And so he just loses it, and so he commits suicide. And then she comes across, and it turns out, again, this is another deva figment. And she comes across him, sees him dead, so she commits suicide. The next thing you know, they're back up in heaven laughing about the whole thing. Tragedy just doesn't work in a multi-lifetime universe. So, okay, we're getting off topic. So, any other questions about the Four Noble Truths? Okay. So again, these are 4 categories for defining your experience, and each of them carries a duty. And the whole purpose of this is to let go of the things that you've been fabricating that have been causing stress. And what happens is you've got the problem here that you're actually trying to get to something unfabricated, but the path itself is something fabricated, which means that there comes a point where after the path has done its work, you have to let it go. And to do that requires a third level of right view, the one that gets you inclined to let go of everything. Ajahn Mun talks about this process. He says, there comes a point in the practice where Four Noble Truths all become one. In other words, you no longer have four duties, you just have one duty, which is to let go, let go, let go. And this is when they're talking about, applying the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self to everything. This is the area when this happens. What happens is you learn to look at views as actions, and first, of course, you apply that to all unskillful views. You say, instead of getting an argument as to whether those views are true or false, you ask, well, what is it to hold on to that view? These views are stressful, they're fabricated, and you want to learn how to let go of them because they're unskillful. And then finally you turn around and apply the same process to right view itself. You say, well, this too is fabricated. If I were to hold on to this, it would be stressful, so I have to learn how to develop dispassion for this as well. Okay. So at this point, everything that you arise, you regard this as just stress, and so there's only one duty, which is dispassion. So as you see, there are three levels of right view, depending on where you are in the practice. And so the question is, as I said from earlier, when you're talking about the three characteristics, or what are actually three perceptions, how do they relate to right view? And they're going to play a different role on each level. When you're talking about the mundane level of right view, where simply the duty is to abandon unskillful things and to develop skillful things, what you're trying to do is develop dispassion for whatever is unskillful. An unskillful thought comes up in the mind, you have to say, this is not really me, this is not really mine, I don't want to identify with this thought as me or mine. So you learn to see how it's inconstant, you learn to see how it's stressful. Like that desire for the pizza. You see, I could sit here and just, get myself all worked up about how much I want that pizza. But then it's wasted time. I could just as easily just go at the end of the day and get the pizza without all this fantasizing beforehand. In the meantime, my mind would be more free to devote to other more useful things. So you learn to see this particular desire is nothing I want to get involved in right now. So you see that it's stressful in order to maintain it, and it's not going to give you that much satisfaction anyhow. So you say, do I want to identify with this? Notice when you're talking about the three characteristics, the Buddha never says, what he does say is this: if something is stressful, if something is inconstant, is it easeful? No, it's stressful. If it's stressful, is it worth identifying as what you are or what your self is? He's not coming to the conclusion that there is no self. He's just saying, is this thing worth identifying with? And you say, no, so you can drop it. So whatever unskillful thoughts come up, whatever unskillful motivations you might have, you learn how to analyze them in terms of these three characteristics. See that you can let them go. So that's how those things function, those perceptions function on the level of mundane right view. In terms of the Four Noble Truths, let's see, there's something more I wanted to say. Oh, and also, let's say in terms of your precepts, there's a passage where the Buddha says, you could suffer loss in terms of wealth, you could suffer loss in terms of relatives, you could suffer loss even in terms of your health. He says those kinds of loss are not serious. The really serious losses are loss in terms of your views and loss in terms of your virtues. Now this comes up with the issue, where you're afraid to observe precepts for the fear that it might be, like you don't want to observe the 8 precepts because you're afraid if I don't get to eat in the evening, it's going to be bad for me physically. You have to say, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing. But the 8 precepts are not nearly as serious as the 5 precepts when you start thinking, well, maybe I have to steal, or maybe I have to do some lying or something in order to gain the wealth that I need to feed my family. The Buddha says that's a serious loss. So here we're dealing with not just ordinary unskillful, easily recognized unskillful habits. There's certain attachments we have to what we think is important that we have to say, I have to learn how to let go of that too. And this is where it begins to bite. It gets into our attachments to things that we feel are actually good. And the whole issue about, there was a discussion a while back about, Buddhism, one of the things that Buddhism lacks is a theory of a just war. And I think it's very good that Buddhism lacks a theory of just war. But there's other people saying, well, if you don't go to war, what could happen to your relatives, what could happen to your freedoms, and those kinds of things. And the Buddha would say it's better to be willing to sacrifice those things rather than to go out and kill. So here you have to learn how to apply the perception of not self, or not owning things, to a lot of things that you actually own on the conventional level. So that's how the three characteristics, or three perceptions, apply to mundane right view. In terms of the Four Noble Truths, the three perceptions apply, and part of those duties. Sometimes you see the three perceptions as identical with the First Noble Truth. That's not the case. They are identical with the process of trying to comprehend suffering, of trying to abandon its cause, and trying to develop the path. In trying to comprehend suffering, you learn to look at, well, what are the things that I tend to cling to that are suffering? The five aggregates, how can I let go of that clinging? And this is where you start applying the perception of not self, or inconstancy, to, say, things like pain, physical pain or mental pain. In terms of the cause, you have to learn how not to identify with the craving, so you can abandon it. In terms of the path, this is very similar to the process that you apply to the question of skillful and unskillful. While you are doing concentration, you do not sit there and say, my concentration is in constant stressful, not self. What you say is, everything that's going to pull me away from concentration is in constant stressful, but not self. But I'm going to make my concentration as constant and pleasant and as under my control as I can. So the concentration itself actually fights the three perceptions. I was just looking at a book right now saying that if you take a very effortful approach to concentration, you're defeating it. And sometimes yes, sometimes no. Your effort has to be finely gauged to how do you learn how to relax into the breath, but also how do you keep your mind from just kind of wandering off to something else. It's a combination of giving it pleasure, but also the carrot and the stick. You need both the carrot and the stick in order to get the mind into concentration. And one of the ways of making sure that you stay in concentration is to learn how to see the possible distractions as in constant stressful, not self. In the forest tradition, when they teach concentration practice, they don't start so much with the technique, they start out with getting you to think about the things that would pull you out of concentration before they pull you out. In other words, prior to the experience of sitting down, or prior to the practice of sitting down. Think a bit about the nature of the body, thinking about the nature of things, of sensuality, why it would be a good thing to get beyond that. In other words, develop the right attitude to be willing to settle down. So here you are thinking about how these things really are not worth the effort that goes into them, so it'd be best to let them go. That's part of the technique of concentration. But for the concentration itself, as Ajahn Lee says, you're trying to create something that is going against the three characteristics. But just as I said just now, you try to make it as constant as possible. You want your attention to just stick with the breath as constantly as you can. Make it as pleasant and easeful as possible, and get it under your control. So those are the duties of the three perceptions in terms of the Four Noble Truths. And then finally, when you get to the ultimate level of right view, then you apply those perceptions to everything, so that you can let go of everything. And it's at that point where they're applied everywhere. Any questions on that? Yes.
Did I understand correctly last night when you were talking about letting go? I think what you said was it's so difficult because we cling so much to these various things that it's easier to shift our clinging to something that's more beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
And so do I take that to mean that's a method, not
It's a strategy, yes. Like the path itself is a strategy. When it's done its work, then you let it go. The Buddha gives the image of the raft. That when you get to the other side of the river, you let the raft go. You don't put it up in your head and carry it as you go on. But the point that people tend to forget about that image is getting across the river. You've got to hold on to the raft. You don't make a show at everybody. Hey, look at me! I'm not holding onto the raft. You fall off. And particularly with the whole issue of feeding, because the mind is feeding, you need to provide it with food on the path. And concentration is the element of the path that's most often identified as a kind of food. The pleasure that it gives, the sense of refreshment, the sense of strength that it gives, that nourishes you. And John Fuang's image, he said, it's like having your engine, having some lubricant. Without the lubricant, it seizes up. And the Buddha's image is like, the path is like having a fortress that you defend, and concentration is the food for the soldiers and the guardians. The soldiers are right effort, and the guardian is right mindfulness. And the concentration feeds those. Yes?
You talked about the order being discernment, virtue, and then concentration.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in concentration, is there a way that
It goes back to the discernment, yeah. Mm-hmm. Because the forest tradition likes to talk about this a lot. It's that all three of these aspects of the path have to help one another along. I mean, the more discernment and the more concentration you have, the easier it will be to be virtuous. The more discernment you have, the easier it is to get the mind in concentration. So the influences go back and forth. Okay, let's look at the readings for a bit. Okay, the first reading is basically the Buddha's definition of right view. Okay. There is what is, on the mundane level, there is what is given, what is offered, what is sacrificed. There are the fruits and results of good and bad actions. There is this world and the next world. There is mother and father. There are spontaneously reborn beings. There are contemplatives and Brahmins who, faring rightly and practicing rightly, proclaim this world and the next, after having directly known and realized it for themselves. Okay, this is basically a statement of conviction. It's kind of a working hypothesis that you're going on. These things haven't been proven to you yet by your own experience, but you take them on as the assumptions that are going to inform your practice. Specifically, if you didn't believe in the power of action to make a difference, there would be no way that you can actually have a path of practice. So you have to have these assumptions in order to practice. As we go through any of these passages, you have any questions about them, just shoot up your hand. And then this is moving from mundane to transcendent right view. This is the graduated talk. That in this case he gave it to Ubali, the householder. Talk on giving, talk on virtue, talk on heaven. He proclaimed the drawbacks, degradation and defilement and sensuality, and the rewards of renunciation. Then when he knew that Ubali the householder was of ready mind, malleable mind, unhindered mind, exultant mind, confident mind, he proclaimed to him the distinctive teaching of the awakened ones: stress, origination, cessation, path. And just as a white cloth with stains removed would rightly take dye, in the same way there arose to Ubali the householder in that very seat the dustless, stainless Dharma eye. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. Then having seen the Dharma, having reached the Dharma, known the Dharma, having gained a footing in the Dharma, having crossed over and beyond doubt, having no more questioning, Ubali the householder gained fearlessness and was independent of others with regard to the teacher's message. There's another passage where Sariputta has experienced the same thing. He goes back and he sees Moggallana, who's at that point is just a friend of his. Neither of them have ordained yet. And Moggallana says, "You look bright. Have you seen the deathless?" And Sariputta says, "Yes." So this Dhamma eye not only sees the fact that everything that has subject to origination is subject to passing away, it also sees the deathless. In fact, it's only when you've seen the deathless that actual that concept would occur to you. Whatever is subject to origination is subject to passing away, because you've seen something that is not subject to origination. It's only after that experience that distinction would occur to you. It's like, until they had electric guitars, there was no such thing as an acoustic guitar, right? They were just guitars. But then once there are electric guitars, now they're acoustic guitars. In the same way, it's when you've had that experience of what is not subject to origination, then the concept, what is everything that is subject to origination, occurs to you. He's crossed over doubt. He becomes independent of others' regard to the teacher's message. In other words, he understands what the Buddha had to say because he saw the atta, the goal to which it was aimed. Any questions on that?
Hearing passages like this, I'm struck over and over again. Someone hears it, they're ready to hear it, they get it, and they just got it. My experience is that I get things, and then other things take away, and I forget. It's much more of an ebb and flow. I'm curious about your thought on what it's really like when you get it.
Well, you have to remember, one, the Buddha was picking all the ripe fruit. And he passed over us. Yeah, not ready yet. And it's up to us to ripen ourselves. Because there comes a point where everything does come together. And when it comes together, then the mind opens up to this other dimension, and it's because you've, as I said earlier, these different factors of the path actually give you practice in what it means to fabricate experience, especially concentration, because you are fabricating, you're putting together, this time skillfully, a state of mind. And as you get more and more into that and doing it skillfully, you get more and more sensitive of what would it be like if nothing was fabricated. And what would that mean? How would you not fabricate an experience? Because you get to a point where you begin to see that every time the mind moves, it moves from one spot to another spot, because it thinks the next spot is going to be better. Either that or it just can't stay here any longer, it has to go down. But one or the other. You're either here or you move. And you finally get to the point where you realize, well, is another alternative besides staying and moving? And if you're at the right point, if you're ready, that's the moment where the mind doesn't fabricate anything, and then it kind of opens up to the unfabricated.
So it's up to us
to get yourself to that spot, yeah. To kind of ripen yourself. It's like that old Zen koan, you climb to the top of the flagpole and there's something climbing up after you. What do? Well, if you're going to let go of the flagpole, you better let go of gravity too. Isn't it a cool thought? Margaret?
Is it fair to say we're pretty much swimming in delusion until we begin to employ right view?
You get your nose above water every now and then. I mean, you wouldn't even be inclined to want right view unless there was some part of you that says, okay, there's something wrong with this.
But I just remember this feeling of almost being shocked at how vast delusion can be. I mean, I think that's, of course, why we're here so many lifetimes.
Exactly. We've been piling up all kinds of delusions. But at the same time, part of, we're suffering, and the question is, how do I get out of this suffering? And you try enough different methods that don't work, and finally you land on something. This sounds like might be right.
Yeah, and to realize there's stress and suffering in the pleasures is quite fascinating.
Whoever gets the White House, I think, is not going to enjoy it. Okay. Anything else? Is it just because it's that hour in the afternoon that it's going to... Okay.
I was wondering if I could just ask one more about right view. And no really right answer. I try to explain myself, kind of yin and yang of a situation. Ooh, this feels bad, but,
Okay, well, notice what the Buddha's talking about. He's talking about, what are you doing to create suffering right now? And you look at that, and there is a right view to that. What am I doing to create suffering around this issue right now? And there's certain things, as you say, there's certain situations outside you that you really can't see where this is going. But you can ask yourself, okay, how am I relating to this right now? Can I make sure that I'm not suffering from this situation right now? So I can actually get a better perspective on what's going on. And maybe be a little bit more patient to see how things work out. And that does have an answer. Now to find that answer is going to be a matter of trial and error. And I don't know if do you know the Buddha's instructions to Rahula? Rahula, his son. Where he's talking about how before you act, ask yourself, what results do I expect of this action? And if you expect harm, you don't do it. If you don't expect harm, you go ahead and do it. While you're doing it, if there's some immediate results coming up, stop. Oh, you made a mistake. You misread the situation. If you don't see anything bad coming up, continue with the action, and then when it's done, look back at it from the long term. And if you see any harm from that you didn't see right away, okay, then you realize, okay, that was a mistake, and then you go talk it over with someone else on the path who can give you some advice.
So right view is really not really right view, it's like right
View. Yeah. It goes through a process for all, and then finally, But what you do is you try your best, and then by trying your best, then you can relearn. If you don't try your best, you're never really going to learn anything. But you try your best not to be harmful. And if it turns out you were harmful, say, okay, learn something. Next time around, I'm not going to do that. Yes.
What about situations where you're pretty sure that this action will harm this person, but it will benefit this person?
Find another action.
Something that would benefit both.
Well, it was like my teacher telling me. I asked him when he asked me to start translating Ajahn Lee. I asked him, well, do you want a literal translation or do you want to get to the essence? He said, both. And that kind of raised the bar. And I discovered, it is possible. So you have to basically raise the bar for yourself. Is there an action that would be helpful to both sides? And again, harming, you have to realize, to really harm somebody is to get them to do something unskillful. Now this may, financially may harm this person but benefit this person. That's not the kind of harm we're talking about. We're talking about, is this going to, well, to some extent we're talking about that. If it's really going to harm somebody badly. But sometimes, okay, it's, this person is going to profit and this person is not going to profit. That's not nearly as serious as, okay, I'm going to get this person to lie or do something of that sort in order to help this other person. That's really harming this person. And that's what you've got to watch out for.
What about if the harm done to one person is that person will likely create conflict?
Okay, now again, if you're stopping that person from, making a bad move, you're actually harming that person, even though that person may think that you're getting in their way. We're talking about killing them or anything, but just basically blocking somebody from doing something harmful. But you can't say, well, just because I think this person is a bad person, I'm going to mistreat them. That doesn't work. You've got to think, what would be for everybody's best interests? Again, that raises the bar. And whether you can actually figure out an answer, at least the fact that you've raised that question might open you to some new possibilities. Okay, the next passage is on the Four Noble Truths, and we pretty much discussed the whole thing. About how the Buddha defined the Four Noble Truths and the duties with regard to them. one thing I wanted to point out here, and that when he's talking about the cessation of stress, in the forest tradition, Ajahn Mun makes a distinction between the third noble truth and nirvana. Often you see the third noble truth is equated with nirvana. He says nirvana is something, the third noble truth is the process of getting there. So, you're finally arriving at nirvana. When you've let go, when you're letting go of all the craving. Once you've let go of the craving, what's left, that's nirvana. And there's no activity associated with that. The letting go, that's something that should be realized, but then the nirvana itself, is you don't have to do anything. And of those terms, the fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go. The term I translate as letting go here can also be translated as lack of nostalgia. You don't miss it. And this is one of the reasons why we keep, having our realizations and then of letting go of something, but then going back to it, because there's a little bit of nostalgia. Yeah, I really like that. It wasn't all that bad after all. Whoop, you go back. But in this case, you say, okay, I don't want this ever again. The next passages have to deal with the ultimate level of right view. And we've got 5 minutes to cover them. The first one, Anandabindika, he's going to see these wanderers. This is one of my favorite conversations in the canon. So, tell us, householder, what views Gautama the contemplative has? Venerable sirs, I don't know entirely what views the Blessed One has. Anandabindika is a stream enterer. And still he says, I don't know entirely what the Buddha's views are. If he doesn't know, none of us know entirely. What we do know is what the Buddha taught about stress, right? Okay. Well, so you don't know entirely what views the Gautama the contemplative has. Tell us what views the monks have. I don't even know entirely what views the monks have. So you don't entirely what views Gautama the contemplative has, or even that the monks have. Then tell us then what views you have. He says, it wouldn't be difficult for me to expound to you what views I have, but please let the Venerable Ones expound each in line with his view standpoint. And so they go through the standard list of what were the hot topics back in those days. Okay. Is the cosmos eternal, not eternal, whatever? And so finally Anandika says, okay, as for the Venerable One who says any of these one views, this is the sort of view I have. His view arises from his own inappropriate attention or independence on the words of others. Now this view has been brought into being as fabricated will dependently co-arisen. Whatever has been brought into being as fabricated will dependently co-arisen, that is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stressful, and this Venerable One thus adheres to that very stress, submits himself to that very stress. You see, he's looking at the view, looking at the process of clinging to a view. He's not taking on the view of whether that's true or not. He's saying, look at when you hold on to this view. How was this view created? And what are you doing when you hold on to the view? What's the result of holding on to it? He says, you're submitting yourself to stress. He says that for all the views. So, and then they say, okay, now we've expounded our views, tell us what view you have. And he says, my view is this. Whatever has been brought into being is fabricated will dependently co-arisen, that is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stressful. Whatever is stressful is not me, is not what I am, is not myself. This is the sort of view I have. Just as a side here, notice here, sometimes you hear they say, the five aggregates are not a self, but they are what you are. But actually, the Buddha said, with the 5 aggregates, you say, this is not me, this is not what I am, this is not myself. The Buddha never defines you as 5 aggregates. That's an important point to notice. He says we create our sense of self out of the 5 aggregates, but he never just says what we are. Because, as he said, if you define yourself, you limit yourself. So just put the question of what you are aside. And just notice where the stress is. Okay. So they thought they've caught him. So, householder, whatever has been brought into being is fabricated will dependently co-arisen, that is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stressful. Thus you adhere to that very stress, submit yourself to that very stress. He says, no, sir. Whatever has been brought into being is fabricated will dependently co-arisen, that is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stressful. Whatever is stressful is not me, is not what I am, is not myself. Having seen this well with right discernment as it has come to be, I also discern the higher escape from it as it has come to be. In other words, the point where the mind opens up, it goes beyond that, by applying the same analysis to that particular view. In other words, you take this analysis of what is it like to hold to a view, and then you apply it, you turn around on your own holding to right view. Now notice you don't do this until right view has done its work. But once it's done its work, you say, well, it's like this tool you've been holding on to build a chair. Okay, once you built the chair, you put the tool down. Well, in this particular case, you use right view in order to take apart your attachment to right view, and then put it down. So that's how you get from the second level of right view to the third level of right view. You kind of apply the second level to itself, and go on. When this was said, the wanderers fell silent, abashed, sitting with their shoulders drooping, their heads down, brooding, at a loss for words. As they say in Thai, som nam na. Serves them right. Okay. Any questions on that passage? Okay, you all understand it, we'll move on. The other two passages simply have to do with the state of mind that lets everything go. Here the Buddha is talking to Kaccayana, who asks him, what is right view? And the Buddha responds, this world is supported by or takes as its object a polarity, that of existence and non-existence. But one sees the origination of the world, and the world here means the six senses. With right discernment as it has come to be, non-existence with reference to the world does not occur to one. In other words, while you're watching things arise, the concept of non-existence doesn't even come to the mind. When you watch the cessation of the world with right discernment as it's come to be, existence with reference to the world does not occur to one. Okay, these concepts at that point don't occur to you. All you see is just arising and passing away, arising and passing away. And it goes on to say, this world is in bondage to attachments, clingings, and biases. It's important that you not be thinking about, well, go ahead, existence or non-existence at that point. Because if you're thinking about existence and non-existence, you're going to hold on to existence. But if you just put those terms out of your mind, just say, look, okay, where is the stress right here? Let's let go of that. This is how he explains this. So one such as this does not get involved with clinging to these attachments, clingings, fixations of awareness, biases, or obsessions, nor is he resolved on myself. At that point, your thought of who you are doesn't even exist. So you're not directly attacking the concept of who you are. You're just looking at things in such a way that these concepts just are not occurring to you, so that you can let go of the cause of the problem. You have no uncertainty or doubt that mere stress when arising is arising, stress when passing away is passing away. That's all you're looking for, is just stress arising and passing away. And that's the one noble truth at that point. That's why you let it go. In this, your knowledge is independent of others. It's to this extent that there is right view. So instead of attacking the sense of who you are, or whether you are something becoming or not becoming, instead of attacking that directly, you get the mind in a state where it's not, those concepts don't occur to it. So you can just look at the process of stress and realize, okay, this is something that deserves to be let go of. And when you see that, okay, this deserves to be let go of, and you can let it go, then all the other problems fall away. Because as soon as you start attacking your sense of self straight on, part of you is going to resist. And if you see that the only alternatives are either existence or non-existence, you're going to go for existence. Or if you say, I don't like who I am, I want to destroy myself, I want to be locked out, then you go for non-existence. But either way, you're going in the wrong direction. So this is how the Buddha gets around that dilemma of craving for becoming and craving for not becoming are both causes of suffering. He said, let's just look at this in terms of stress arising and passing away without getting involved in those issues at all. And that's how you get around them. You can see the Buddha is a very strategic thinker, a very strategic trainer of the mind. Any questions on that? Yes. Go ahead.
Actually, this goes back to the prior passage.
Mm-hmm.
Read the last piece there, which is one passage at the very end of the Buddha says, monks, even the monks who is long, penetrate the Dhamma, this Dhamma, Vinaya, would do well periodically and righteously to refute the wonders of other sects in just this way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it kind of sounds like prophesying.
Well, every now and then,
I don't unless they were asked a question first. This, to me, kind of sounds like it's going after.
Well, they asked him. And there are a couple places where the Buddha goes after some other wanderers too. And it's always on the issue of karma. People teaching, that everything that you experience either comes from the past, or it comes from a creator God, or it's totally random and without cause. And those views are so pernicious from the Buddhist point of view that you've got to go out and get them from time to time.
One other small little thing here, and it just in the sentence before that it says, and he got keeping God up and then keeping the blessed one on his right side.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't. What is there some tradition or a rule about being on the right?
Well, back in India, if you left somebody, you would kind of walk around them with your right side to them, and then. And this is why we have the tradition of, when you circumambulate around a jetty or a stupa, you keep your right side to the jetty. It's a way of showing respect. The devas always do that when they leave the Buddha. And you have other people who will show respect to the Buddha that way too. But yeah, it's not the case that monks just sit there and never say anything. Occasionally when you see that's the proper issue, you say something has to be said, then you say it. But you have to weigh the consequences. When the Buddha talks about, there are people who are just not worth getting involved in an argument at all. They won't recognize they won't admit when you've made a good point. Or they will deny, after they've said something, they'll deny that they said it. That kind of thing. He said, these people are just not worth it. There was one case, though, there was a wanderer from another sect, his name was Sachaka, which is interesting because it means truth teller, who comes to see the Buddha and tries to argue that the five aggregates are yourself. And the guy basically creates his own trap, and the Buddha catches him in the trap. And you realize that the guy himself doesn't become Buddhist at the end. He just pays his respect to the Buddha and goes. But the guy had brought on a lot of people to listen to him defeat the Buddha. And instead, of course, the Buddha defeats him. So this is one case where the Buddha said, I've got to take this person on. But he does tell the monks, getting into formal debates, this is a tradition that happened in India after the Buddha passed away. And there was, to some extent, there was before he passed away, which was kings would hold debates. You ascend to the throne. You say, okay, I'm going to decide who I'm going to support. I'm going to hold a debate. I'm going to pose certain questions. And whoever gives the most satisfactory answer to my questions, that's the group I'm going to support. And the Buddha said, stay away from those debates. Because what happens is that the person who poses the question, he's in charge. Now, there are a lot of questions that the Buddha did not answer. Is there a self? Is there no self? No answer. Is the world eternal? Not eternal? No answer. And that enabled him to be in charge of what questions he was going to address and which ones he was not. But you go into one of those debates, the person who posed the question, they're in charge. You can't say, okay, that's a bad question. And the Buddha said, stay away from those debates. Before we break for the middle afternoon, there's that great Ajahn Geoff story about the questions. He was in London, or England someplace. He'd given a Dharma talk, and at the end of the Dharma talk, he asked if there are any questions, and this one woman said, well, there's a question I've been asking a lot of other monks who come through here, and I've never gotten a satisfactory answer. And there are different versions of, what the question was she asked. And the version I prefer was, what happens to someone when they gain awakening? Do they still exist or do they not exist? And Ajahn Geoff says, well, this is one of those questions we don't answer, and I'll try to explain why. And the candle's burning next to him. And he says, no, you see the flame of the candle here? While it's burning, we can describe the shape and the color of the flame, right? He said, yes. Puts it out. So now that it's out, can we talk about the shape and the color of the flame? He says, no. He says, well, in the same way, we can't talk about someone who's gained awakening. And then he says, does that answer satisfy you? And she says, no. And he said, well, in that case, I'm not satisfied with your question. Don't you wish you could have said that on a high school on a high school test? Okay. Just one more passage, and then we can break. Okay. This is one more passage where they're talking about all dhammas are unworthy of attachment. Okay, this is when you're letting go of everything. You have to remember, Moggallana is about to become an arahant. He's ready to go. And so this is the point where the Buddha pulls out the big guns. All dhammas, that would include the path, everything, are unworthy of attachment. Having heard this, you directly know every dhamma. Directly knowing every dhamma, you comprehend every dhamma. Comprehending every dhamma, then whatever feeling you experience, pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain, you remain focused on inconstancy, dispassion, cessation, relinquishing. As you remain focused on inconstancy, dispassion, cessation, relinquishing to that feeling, you are unsustained by, or you do not cling to anything in the world. Unsustained, you are unagitated. Unagitated, you are bound right within. That's an interesting connection. Unsustained, you are not agitated. Not that you're not clinging to anything, you're not having to feed anything, so there's no agitation. It's not like having any stocks in the stock market. The stock market can go up and down, you are not agitated. If you're trying to feed off the stock market, you're reading every little thing coming out of the stock market. See? You discern birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done, there's nothing further for this world. This is how you're released through the ending of craving, utterly complete, utterly free from bounds, a follower of the utterly holy life, utterly consummate, foremost among devas and human beings. Okay, it's at this point where you let everything go. And that state of mind where you're just, whatever comes up, you let go, let go, let go. That's at the verge of arahantship. But to get there, you have to develop the path. You have to work with mundane right view. You have to work with the second level of right view to get the mind to be in a position where it can actually do this and gain awakening. Otherwise, if you simply try to clone awakening by saying, well, I'll just be okay with whatever comes up, your mind is not getting properly fed. And when it's not properly fed, it's going to go out and feed off of whatever can find roadkill. Whatever. Any questions on that? Yes?
I know people are trying to break, but I'm not sure I quite get the difference between the second type and the third type of right view, like in terms of the Four Noble Truths versus what you're talking about.
Okay, when you're working with the Four Noble Truths, you've got four duties, and you have a duty only with one, to let go, and that's craving. You have to develop the path. Now, to develop the path, you've got to hold on to your practices. So you're making a distinction. I'm not letting go of everything right yet. That's the difference.
Versus in the third type,
You've completed the developing of the path. There's nothing more to develop.
So I mean, you'd already probably be a stream
Yeah, you'd have to, stream enter, non-returner, before you're really able to let go of everything. At the moment of stream enter, you really do let go, at least for a brief time. But the mind is not totally prepared for total letting go yet. Question?
So going back to formations and applications, so as the sankharas are coming up, we're using the mind's application to create an application, to feed the mind.
Right. The hunger.
The hunger,
Mm-hmm.
the reaction to the sankharas.
Not just a reaction, the fact that in here you've got a vicious cycle. In other words, you're feeding off of these things, but in order to feed off these things, you have to create a sense of who you are. That you've got the ability to fix the food. These abilities that you have, these skills that you have. There's a sense of you as the self, as the producer. That self as producer also has to be fed. In other words, you've got this body, so that you can find food, but then the body itself needs food. So there's a cycle going on here. Because this is what it means to be a being, is you have a desire and you try to fulfill that desire. That's how you create your identity. Once you've got an identity, you have to sustain it with more food. So, the desire itself leads to more. You're trying to get out of that.
Getting yourself to samadhi is feeding it so that you're not feeding it.
going for the shit in the toilet. Yeah, yeah.
Keeping awareness, keeping samadhi,
Mm-hmm.
allows you to get to a state where you can actually access the
Right. Mm-hmm. This is why when the Buddha talks about getting the mind in concentration, he's talking about getting into concentration for fairly long periods of time. Because the mind needs to have that kind of long-term nourishment. It's not like kind of jumping in, jumping, getting there and staying. And feeling really good about staying. And if you're going to be attached, you're attached. As Ajahn Fuang used to say, is if you're not really crazy about the concentration, you're not going to master it. You have to be really kind of attached to it. And since this is a Ajahn Chah's there at the back of the room, I'll end with an image from Ajahn Chah. He says, it's like coming back from the market, you've got a banana in your hand. And someone says, that's a banana, what are you going to do with it? And you say, I'm going to eat it. And they say, are you going to eat the peel too? No. Then why are you carrying the peel? And the Ajahn says, how are you going to answer them? And his answer comes in two stages. The first stage is, you're going to answer with desire. In other words, you have to have the desire to come up with a good answer to get the right answer, right? So desire is going to be part of the path. Part of your discernment. It has to come from the desire to do this well. And then, of course, the answer is going to be, because the time hasn't come to let go of the peel. And if you let go of the peel now, all you have is mush in your hands. When I get it home, the peel will have served its purpose. I can take the peel, throw it away, and eat. That's the final letting go, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's break. We'll come back in 20, 25 minutes.